Hey y'all, Kelly Moody here. Welcome to the Ground Shots podcast, a podcast that explores our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling. Well, here we are, a new episode of the podcast, number 85. It is New Year's Day. I haven't put out an episode in a few months, and been doing a lot of other things and sitting on a few conversations that I have been working on whenever I have time. And the one that we are putting out today is one of those, and I'm excited to share it. It was super interesting conversation to me, and I interact with Cara pretty regularly, so I've gotten to know her and, living in community with her, and the unique way that she moves about the world. And this time to sit down with her was pretty sweet, because as someone who studied philosophy formally and has a lot of big questions that often I explore on this podcast, it was neat to just ask her some of these things, like, what do you think from the perspective that you see through? And yes, so here we are, finally putting one out. I think the last episode was in early July, maybe, with Jeff Wagner of the Colorado River piece, and a lot of people really loved that one, so thank you so much for your attentive ears in that very educational episode. This one will also be pretty educational in a very different way, and my lapse of time between episodes isn't for the fact that the episodes aren't popular or that people don't want more. It's just more of like, what can I manage to do and weave in my life and with things happening. And there was a good chunk of time this season that I was living in my truck in the woods, sleeping in the woods. I had no quiet place to record, or really didn't have a lot of personal space for a second there. So being able to do stuff with the podcast was pretty difficult, because having space to focus with internet and quiet, as I've mentioned in the earlier years of the podcast, being kind of nomadic with it is a factor you don't think about sometimes as a listener, or you forget about or take for granted. So I am grateful for the moment to have some space to work on it, and quiet and peace to be able to put some more episodes out. So here we are in the new year, or at least the new Gregorian year. And I'm excited to share this one. So a little bit about this episode and some housekeeping before we get into it. We did this in-person interview in Paonia, Colorado this summer, in the yard of the wood shop that Cara's partner owns, and it's where I have some studio space. So we retreated from the busyness of the studio, and the town in the summertime is just very busy, especially at that spot. And we tucked into my camper, which I had parked in the yard while working on it at the wood shop, and did this conversation. So sometimes you can hear a little bit of the street noise here and there, but nothing too dramatic. Cara is a mother, artist, author, professor, action-philosopher, environmental justice organizer. She is a professor of transdisciplinary ecological leadership, has published dozens of interdisciplinary books and articles on critical philosophy, climate justice, art, epigenetics, gender, sexuality, and ethnic studies, including the critically acclaimed Zazu Dreams Between the Scarab and the Dung Beetle, a cautionary fable for the Anthropocene era, and Vicious Expectations, Justice, Vulnerability, and the Obscene, which is what I decided to name this episode, because with everything we talked about, it was really hard for me to know the best name for this episode. And it's something we get into in this conversation, is a lot around words and the weight that they hold. So felt like it was just fitting to name the episode after her big book that she put out and let me borrow it this spring for a little while, and it'll make more sense as you get into the episode what all of that is about. Her theoretical and visual work is the subject of documentaries for international films and public television, and she has been interviewed by New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, among others. And Alongside Archbishop Desmond Tutu in Vandana Shiva, she received the Random Kindness Community Resilience Leadership Award in 2020. Her work has been endorsed by Noam Chomsky, Bill McKibben, James E. Hansen, Eve Ensler, among a handful of other wonderful academics and thinkers, scholars, artists, etc. Her photographs and performance videos have been defended by freedom of speech organizations. And in this conversation, we'll get into a little bit of her work and why it's controversial often. And there are some photographs featured in the slides for this episode from her work, and you can go to her website that's linked in the show notes and find the bulk of the rest of her photograph and video work publicly available for viewing, but there's just a few snaps in the slides if you want to kind of get a glimpse of her work. I'm not going to name all the bullet points of what we talk about in this episode, but a few of the themes are speaking about the meaning of words. The word etymology means the study of words and their history and deeper meaning. So we get into a lot about language and how words can imply domination and alienation when we don't realize it. And we get into symbols and identity and the war in Gaza. We talk about salt and eugenics and privilege and what does privilege even mean. We talk about gender and the body and this idea of the body as being a space that represents so much more that's actually really happening culturally, and the systems that infiltrate everything. And the title of this episode, which is the title of Cara's book, is speaking to that and how we can become better aware of these systems that infiltrate everything and create and recreate the very things we think we're against. So those are just a few of the things that we get into, a few of the themes. And how does what we see as gross tell us about how we see the female body or any body, the earth or land-based culture? I feel like that last piece was probably the most fascinating part of this conversation for me, in unpacking my own internalized gender oppressive feelings and navigating that in my life too, as someone, and seeing often how others impose that on me, and having grace for it, and also pushing against it, and not normalizing things that aren't that shouldn't be happening, and that don't serve us as a collective and as individuals. And before we get into the episode, a few housekeeping things, and I'll keep it short because I know you guys love my long introductions. And I'm also sorry for the echo of the background room where I'm recording. I don't have my microphone with me right now to make it a little more crisp and poignant, so forgive me for the echo. You can support the podcast in a few ways. We have a Substack, groundshots.substack.com. You can join for free and read my more personal writings and research pieces I put out on occasion. We put podcast episodes out on there, and I do have some member-only podcast episodes as well that are extra on Substack, so groundshots.substack.com. You can buy seeds from Vibrant Earth Seeds, regionally adapted seeds to the Southwest, based out of McElmo Canyon, Colorado, in the Four Corners. Use GroundShots10 at checkout for 10% off all orders, and I also get a kickback. So it's not a huge thing that brings me income or anything for the podcast, but it does give me a little bit of money here and there, a few bucks. It gives them some support. So it's time to order seeds right now, here in the midst of the winter, and plan for your future gardens. So order from them. It would help us both. You can also go support traditional tanners and take online high tanning courses with Matt Richards. I've been tanning for years, and I did it all without any really fancy instruction. and finally getting to take the course last winter with him was a really cool way to refresh some of my knowledge or expand some of my knowledge, and definitely some of the geekier ways of understanding bark tanning leather naturally with plant matter. And so I highly recommend taking any of these classes from traditional tanners. You can go to brandtan.com to find the classes. They're really affordable. As someone who's been tanning for years, certainly, doing tanning in person and experimenting on your own is really important. And then taking this class, he sends you a kit and you actually do it alongside a group and get to do it by hand and see what's actually happening every step of the way. So it's a really cool way to demystify the whole process. And if you follow me online in any way, one of my big interests is natural tanning leather. And we've done some episodes about that for the podcast, including one on bark tanning with Stephen Edholm. Go back a few years and you can find that one. We geek out on it. Well, here's another way you can geek out. So brandtan.com. You can sign up. There's classes through winter and spring. What else? You can buy me a book through my bookshop account or buy a book for yourself on our wish list or our list of recommended books. And when you buy from Bookshop instead of Amazon, we get a kickback. Tiny one, but it's still something. And it also supports reading awesome books. And a lot of these books we get into on the podcast in some form or another at some point, mention them or talk about the ideas in them. So that's a really great way to read, expand your educational time, researching anything you might hear on this podcast, and also support us. You can Venmo Kelly-Moody-6 or PayPal us, linked all in the show notes. And one more thing before we go, starting another annual fundraiser for the podcast. I did one last year at this time and it was super successful, and you guys really showed up to support the project. And as I put out this episode, I am also launching the fundraiser in celebration of my 38th birthday coming up February 4th to help support keeping this project going. It costs money for it to exist, even if I don't put new stuff out. And it also costs money to make new episodes happen. There's a lot of behind the scenes costs of making these. And since I've really tried to be non-corporate about this the whole time I've done it, it has really made it hard to support it financially. And I also haven't gotten any grants or anything like that because it's such an interdisciplinary project. It's something we talk about in this episode, actually, why interdisciplinary thinking is important and yet is very hard to economically fit. And yet we live in a capitalist world. So your support of the podcast through the fundraiser, I think the goal I set this year is $2,500. Very reasonable for podcast support. Some podcasts have way bigger overhead, and this is just a little snippet of money that would help keep this project afloat and going and forward moving. And I have some things in mind this year that I would love to do with the podcast. And I mention it in the fundraiser in more detail, but documenting some time in Mexico coming up with Samuel, which I will talk about a little bit more on the podcast soon. And also maybe doing some more river-focused episodes, potentially on rivers myself, but to be determined. And your support will help make that more possible. Also, I know that people would love more video. I know a lot of podcasts are doing video and showing episodes on YouTube, getting to actually see people in conversation together. And sometimes I definitely put out some of the Zoom style conversations on YouTube for people to see us talking on Zoom. But there's plenty I do in person, including like this one you're about to listen to. And it is really sweet to be able to see people actually talking. And I've always been a very video curious person from the art perspective, and I would love to be incorporating video more in this project. So again, that support through the fundraiser will also help that become a little bit more of a reality this season. So with that, coming at you from Paonia, Colorado, kind of cold day. Let's go ahead and get to this conversation with Cara, and I hope you glean some important insight from it. Happy listening, you guys.
No, yeah, it's if your part of your work is writing or doing research or something, you kind of, it's like, you have to, it's one of the things.
Craziness.
Yeah. I went up to Overland Lake the other day and somebody had a Starlink up there, which is kind of interesting.
That they brought with them?
Well, it's up on their van roof. And they're just camping and working up there. And I'm like, damn. Like, part of me is like, this is super weird.
And
another part of me is like, you know what? I'd rather be up there than down here.
I know.
So it's this
these hypocrisies or contradictions or just realities. I know. I am
that little
tormented by them.
Connection.
Yeah.
You can't escape Babylon no matter where you go.
Yeah.
So what do you do? Yeah.
Well, and can we bring... I just learned, and I'm trying to find out more about some of the neuroscience about wonder and awe, and that actually enhances a sense of lucidity and a sense of coherence, which just is like, it's such a thrill, and that it makes collective action more efficient if we're in a state of wonder and awe. So, I mean, it would make sense, again, all these bridges, how I was just having a very challenging, beautiful but challenging conversation about how do we really get into, how do we get into spaces that aren't still rooted in mind-body dichotomies? Where, and how do we, with integrity, inhabit places of that are not rooted in these mind-body dichotomy assumptions, and how can we function individually and collectively in those spaces in a beautiful way.
Yeah, I was just reading about some of that in your work, and then thinking about when I used to think about that a lot, and then, you know, where did it begin? How is it still deeply rooted in our culture and
these
affecting
dichotomies?
A lot of things, like especially mind and or body and spirit, you know, or the mind as just simply this other part of that's just inhabiting the body or something, and how is that like translated into our world so much that we don't even realize it's happening. I think there's so many things like that are harmful.
Yes. Yeah.
And what would it look like? I think about this when I teach my ecology classes too, because I'm like, what would it look like if we didn't have the grocery store entity, we didn't have capitalism, we didn't have private land ownership, those entities that are so normalized, like if we took all those away, could you imagine that everything around us is one big garden? I guess garden is a construct too, but like one big garden.
A jungle.
You know, or, I mean, jungle sometimes means untended, you know, the way that we imply it, but it's actually a tended landscape, but because we're seeing through a lens of Eurocentrism, we don't see it as tended, and we're blind to that. It's like what has been happening here, that maybe all these plants have been tended by indigenous peoples historically and planted, and like, but we have the constructs that show us this is what food looks like, this is what shelter looks like, this is what it means to be human together looks like, and so it's hard to see past that because those are all there. And we can't fully pull them away, but we can use awe and wonder potentially, or imagination. As
ways to begin to unveil what is in front of us. Yeah. Already, like in my first book, Viscous Expectations, Justice, Vulnerability, the Obscene. The obscene is that it's the offstage. It's what's behind, but what's in front of us simultaneously. Just like these infrastructures, these hidden systems that are not hidden, but where there are symbols, you know, like there's a manhole on the ground that's indicating this entire infrastructure of water and sewage and transaction beneath us. But what if that was apparent? To me, that kind of what if goes with your question of what if those grocery stores, because the grocery store is part of an infrastructure of alienation, right, and disassociation, and I'm curious about how you're choosing those three: grocery store, capitalism and private property. And I mean, because
not
it
that
seems
they're
like
separated or anything.
Well, yeah, and it seems like the grocery store is the manifestation of capitalism and private property, and they're sort of almost interwoven subsets.
It's just an abstraction of how to feed our bodies. You know, you have to exchange this energy that you spend your days creating and generating to buy a food in a box to then eat, sometimes alone or maybe with other people. But when there's food all around us that we don't have time to learn or understand or process.
Right.
And some of those foods are plants or beings that are asking for us to be in engagement with them because they're co-evolved with us, right?
Right, those interspecies intimacies.
I mean, and then the private land ownership is just like another layer, right? Like, we aren't allowed to do things with our bodies on one side of a fence or another, or we are allowed on one side of the fence or another. So how does that, like, even within permaculture as a reaction to the disconnect is like this, you know, it's an amalgamation of lots of different people's philosophies and ideas about how to manage land or be in relationship to ecologies, but it's also often very within the framework of private land ownership.
Yes.
In this, we could do something in this confine, but what about the watershed that flows over here and over here and
the crossing side? Boundaries, the promiscuous crossings. No, absolutely, absolutely. And when the private property, when we begin to recognize that the only way that can exist is if there's a sense of entitlement, and that absolutely goes into the grocery store mentality, that people are entitled to not have to be laborers of the land, and to not have to learn, and to not have to be in the dirt, right? I mean, it gets into feudalism.
There's a whole other, you know, racism, these ideas,
or
like anti-animism. Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Although that dirt touching is like lowly and bad. You know?
Right, yeah.
But the disconnection's actually more evolved.
Yeah. Well, and I talk about, I write about assimilation as hygiene, and that idea of all of our misunderstandings of what it means to be clean. Property, in French, propre is to be clean, and property, propre, what's socially appropriate, all these layers of, again, total Eurocentrism. Yeah. Right, around our bodies, the whole body phobia, our bodies as unclean, and that the mind is somehow superior, when in fact our brain and our gut, you know, and embryologically we're at the same cells. And how do we be in a state of curiosity and inquiry and totally embodied at the same time, also in infrastructural contexts?
Yeah,
you know, totally. I mean, that would be so exciting, and I just don't see it. You know, we can have our conversations, and it's and amazing books and articles, but where does it translate into a movement? Where does it translate into a way of being collectively?
How do you get people to not leave mattresses that you have to spend $40 to dispose of?
Right.
Or when the sign says don't leave mattresses,
or to not even buy the mattress in the first place. I mean, you know, there's
creating something you're going to end up throwing away eventually.
Yeah. In State College where I used to teach at Penn State, every year the students would buy new mattresses and then throw them away. And
I've dumpster dived at a lot of colleges.
Right, yeah.
This tile
There's so much. Oh, did this come from a college?
Mars Hill College.
Oh, in North Carolina.
Asheville.
Yeah,
Somebody made that tile.
Yeah, it's a great one. Yeah, right. University. And what a horrifying irony that these people are going into to educational spaces as just these raging consumers and raging disposers. And it just reminds me, when I was an undergrad in 1991, I was teaching an after-school program that I tried to call Body and Community, but the school board didn't let me use the word body. Wow. So I called it Ecology and Community. and we were doing web building in that, this is 1991. So it's about web building, about relationships, that kind of web, with these 5th and 6th grade inner city kids. And it was all about not taking like the food in the grocery store for granted. When you go and you get, or in the school cafeteria, a milk carton, where did that milk come from? What would it be like to actually feel the teats of the cow, and to be in a sensual space, but also a concentric circles of expansion space of understanding the relationship between the farmer and the cow, and the land and the cow, and not just the extraction, and the transaction, or a grapefruit. That was in New York, where grapefruits didn't grow, and what would it be like to as you were talking about before with interspecies intimacies, to have that kind of language with what we were ingesting and putting in our bodies, and where the language of acquisition, I was just looking into the history of the word to acquire, and it's connected to inquire, so it's not connected to disassociation and alienation and hurting other people in order to getting what we want, but it's connected to asking questions. And what if when we woke up in the morning, that was what was informing how we were moving through time and space, and not just, I have these things to do because I have to pay my rent, or because I have to be seen in the world.
Yeah, I battle those things every day. Yeah. You saw my art show, and I'm also like, none of this is commodifiable, and
because it takes so much time to make.
Well, and it's like a kind of anarchy, or it's a kind of like resistance to slow down. Like you look at the way that people make baskets historically, and how long it took. So exploring a material process as a resistance to a world that encourages us to do things efficiently and fast, and to commodify every aspect of what we do. I sometimes have to commodify some of those things, but I've resisted it for a long time, But like the exploration in that engagement, like even just where did the milk come from, and the like whole world that opens up is just like, well, what does it mean to like push against what time means in our relationship with the things we use. Absolutely. As I'm looking at baskets. Yeah. I didn't make all these. Some of these are made by other people that I got them from, but just like the since I know where that one came from, the woman I got that from lives on an off-grid homestead in Idaho, and she has cooked on fire for 40 years. Wow. Right. And not used propane on her land at all. Yeah. And like built their whole house out of like half timber framed milled stuff from their land, half like random stuff from the junkyard, like carpet as insulation and all this stuff. So it's like this crazy. But they don't have cell phone service out there. They have a landline and a radio. And do they have kids? They raise kids out there. They're all adults now, and they all live normal lives, not like them. They're all like, one of them runs a restaurant, one does this. They're all like. Because I'm always so curious what the translation is with child rearing. But they have such a sweet relationship with their kids, even though their kids live differently than them. But whenever I'm out there with them, it's like time is totally different. What time, they take to make the things around them. Yeah. And there is a kind of, the words radical are overused. Radical is overused, and sustainability is overused. And sacred even. Isn't it tragic? These words that are so beautiful, but then like the word trauma even, right? Yeah. I mean, it's all this. What does it even mean anymore? Reduction, yeah. It's so co-opted. I want to say before we keep going, because we kind of jumped right in, I would love to step back for a second, and if you have a way you like to introduce yourself to contextualize you in to people, for people who maybe don't know you or anything about you, how would you introduce yourself in your work frame, and then we can continue into some of the questions I've written down are kind of connected to some of the things we've already started talking about, but it'd be cool, including my name. Sure, whatever you want to say. I certainly could just read something that you've already written online or something, but if you have any way you like to
Well, the first thing that comes up, you said work. And
work.
Yeah, work. Right. And just thinking again, what is it? To be without these definitions that are delineating passion from income generating, from what our bodies do, what our bodies potentially can do, what our consciousness is, what our imaginations individually and collectively can explore, and really take creative risks.
So that was with a caveat of, like, I often think about what words mean and symbolize as we use them and leverage them in our society. So, like, I'm used to saying that, introduce yourself and your work. What do you do? But really, like, we all do things all the time. So you could also you'd say whatever you want to say. But yeah.
Well, and is what we do all the time actually representing what we care about? What is how we live, essentially how we wake up in the morning, and how we brush our teeth, and how we go to the bathroom, what relationship we have to how we're cleaning ourselves when we go to the bathroom. Are we going to the bathroom in a bucket with sawdust that came from nearby orchard trees, or into a toilet that flushes? And how can those layers of not consciousness as in a mental consciousness, but consciousness as a cellular consciousness, be so deeply integrated that we're not defining this as activism, this is organizing, this is parenting, where the promiscuous border crossing, the promiscuous crossings, where these ways of being in relation are a language of living and of coevolution, and not just something that we're trying on, like sustainability. Mm-hmm. So my name is Cara Judea Alhadeff, and the work I do is the life I live, and the struggle I struggle, and I guess every noun is then a verb, because it is the work I am doing is constantly questioning and looking, not explicitly looking for connections, but coming across, I'm hoping, with a sense of certainly awe and curiosity, when there's another, so this, like when I learned about wonder being an avenue for clarity, when so often my world has been shaped by a tyranny of clarity as reduction. And I have resisted that by playing again and again with clarity, not as a honing down or honing in, but a relationship of ambiguities, and ambiguities that feed and nourish each other. And how do we take that on as a practice when we're in relation to our partners, or when we're in relation to our children or our family members, or people who are coming in and out of our free store soul space, shared opportunity, used local, where there's a sense of mutual responsibility, the ability to respond, the ability to be not hypervigilant or always on guard, but always engaged in a way, always that sense of aliveness. And that's where the work is.
It's hard to not be always on guard, or often on guard, rather. Yeah. In a world that has a lot of assaulting qualities.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and what I find are the assaults are with the people who I would most find allyship with, or I would think I would, because people are so on edge, including myself, obviously, and feeling defensive and judged, and like what we were talking about before, that we're so immersed on these norms that, for example, often I'm in spaces where people talk about the idea of just the term darkness comes in relation to negativity or something that they're struggling with, and it's a time over and over I'm asking people, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, how can I say this in the most graceful way where people don't feel that they're being judged, but then the term language police comes up.
Yeah.
If I ask, would you mind considering using another term besides dark to refer to something negative, because I really feel it's not just that I'm going into an intellectual mode that I think is bullshit anyway, that we're making that dichotomy between intellect and heart spirit, but that it does influence all these realms of institutionalized racism.
Yeah.
When we're talking,
and that the earth is bad, the feminine is bad, or
and that
dark skin
also
is bad.
Right.
Yeah.
So all of these
associations.
Yeah.
I've brought that up because we have a lot of in mainstream, I don't know, like Judeo-Christianity too, and the institution of it anyways, this association of lightness, white.
Right.
The white clothing, the light, whatever.
Purity.
The wedding dress is white.
Clean. It goes back
it's
to
like white skin is superior, all these things, and so like it is a curious thing to observe that, and I have thought about that before too. Yeah. And I've caught myself in my own writing how I sometimes have said that and then been like, but why do I say dark to associate with a place that's negative or bad, or like, and I've seen other writers bring that up too.
Yeah.
I can't think of who right now, but just it's like, how do you bring up the curiosity behind these words that we accept without it being attack? And
so for example, you just use the term Judeo-Christian, right,
which has a whole loaded thing too.
And my experience is that term is an extraordinary misnomer. It's an unwriting of history. It's a rewriting of history that does not acknowledge, embrace, witness the complexities of Judaism, and it again takes complexity and makes it digestible in a way that's actually going to make us sick.
I mean, I thought about it before I said it, because like Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, which have some similar origins but very different diverging origins too, and like ideas and things, like putting them all together to try to speak generally about them, just like
about monotheism.
It's like that there's so much more, all of those religions dangerous. Have so much more. I mean, I had an indigenous person tell me on the podcast they don't like BIPOC because they feel like it puts all indigenous people into these group. These
monolithic.
We're all so different. Yeah. I don't like being called that.
And then actually white versus BIPOC, right?
Yeah, like I'm not a BIPOC. I'm this tribe, this person.
Very specific. Right.
That is that homogenization, even in the leftist language.
Oh, very much. Well, that's what I was saying about the people who you'd think I would be allies with, right? Mm-hmm. That's where the most discomfort comes up, and where people, because I guess people feel like they're trying so hard to language things in an inclusive way, or language things in a way that respects the multiplicity, that we still are compounding and recreating these hierarchies, these power structures.
When we think we're not.
Right. Yeah. And that's the scariest realm, I find. Like living in the United States, where people use the term freedom and democracy in the way that it's so laughable, and it's such the levels of complicity and the lack of willingness to witness our complicity and to imagine beyond complicity, or to play with the ambiguity and the contradiction around complicity and power structures like the infrastructure of cars, car culture, the infrastructure of smartphones, smartphone culture, app culture, these realms that filter in as so normalized, and people are internalizing them as inevitable. And in the left, just as much as anyone else, if not more so in many ways. And how can we question it, live it, and move beyond it simultaneously?
It at the same time.
Yeah.
I had written down a question, actually. The first one was the words interdisciplinary and critical, why are they important, applied to thinking about solving problems, or even living in the world today. And we've kind of basically touched on that in a way of like the curiosity and the awe. And sometimes I think about the word critical, which is being used a lot lately in different contexts among the philosophy world too, but
critical
because philosophy. It's kind of or critical ecology, or when I'm teaching some of my classes, I'm like, this is not just an ethnobotany course.
Right.
Me as someone not indigenous to this place, teaching about the ethnobotany of this place, it's a subversion of ethnobotany, really, and
it's the simultaneity.
It's both learning learning your own connection in a place that has a colonial violent history of why we're disconnected in the first place. And so it doesn't feel like it does justice for me to name something the same sort of soundbite words that other people are naming these classes of reconnection, or it's more why are we reconnecting? Why are we why are humans and nature separate in this society? Why is that one of the institutions? So critical and interdisciplinary are curious words to me, and I guess I wonder if you have any thoughts on why they are important.
Yeah, I feel heartbroken and soul shredded around both words. Having been a university professor in interdisciplinary action, where it was one of the titles of my classes was critical pedagogy. And for me, that was about, again, asking questions. It was about this critical as the imperative. We have to, it's critical. We must. But the way the class was assumed by many of the students was that it was give me like a neoliberal banking, give me information,
didactic learning.
I'm gonna operational rather than relational. And what if we were taking on critical as, in order to respect every breath we take, in order to respect ourselves, in order to forgive ourselves or in order for myself to forgive me for being in continual contradiction, for being a hypocrite in so many ways, for living the both and. In Arabic and Hebrew, la-om, L-A apostrophe A-M.
In both languages, that's there.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's my understanding. Both and. And how to live that is the critical element. That is the interdisciplinary element. And again and again, interdisciplinary, it's just, we're going to have a smattering of this, a smattering of that, where it's side by side, but not even, and the weaving doesn't even, that image doesn't even work. In English, I don't know that we have a word that represents that, the vitality of what it means to be really intersectional, really interdisciplinary. Like the Avanzada movement of the early 70s in Chile was an art movement. Do you know about the Avanzada movement? The art movement that it was a group of artists who were fighting against Pinochet's dictatorship, but because of the cultural environment where art and politics and daily living, they weren't separated, but they weren't interwoven. They just breathed each other. Like if interdisciplinarity and intersectionality, we use these words in ways that are, I guess, so disappointing to me. And what if we could breathe that multiplicity, that pluriverse of possibility and imagination and lived matter, and thinking about nouns as verbs and objects as storytellers, and these realms of, again, integrity is what comes up, integrity of coherence, but not by any means solid boundaries. Again, the promiscuous crossings and the flow and the fluidity, with integrity. Like thinking about the Institute of Social Ecology in Vermont with Murray Bookchin in the early 90s, right after that program Ecology and Community that I did with the inner city school children in New York. One of the ideas that we were playing with was the tyranny of structurelessness. So, right, we're not falling into that realm of just what a lot of people criticize postmodernism to be, which I think is ridiculous. I mean, I think there was so much joy in that movement with
oh, you're all good.
That was the joy. Is that
no, it's fine.
That's okay. The water.
Get some water.
It's actually beautiful.
Yeah, on those spalted ponderosa, dying ponderosa trees from the bugs that killed them.
Oh, the beetle. Yes.
Yeah, the beetle killed ponderosa. Gets a little water. It's all good.
Exactly.
From not getting enough water. That's why they died.
Oh, okay. So that to me is postmodern, right there. I mean, that's interdisciplinary. That's the pluriverse of possibility.
Yeah. You know, that's what I think about all the time, is that kind of stuff. But I also have a philosophy degree and studied postmodernism in college.
Yeah.
And I haven't read the people who were the voices behind that in a big way for a long time. But they're all those things like wash in you, affect you, and you don't really know anymore what it is. It's all like there and a part of everything, you know. But
you mean the readings that you did, or
anything I study, but like, yeah,
it's not part of your cellular.
It is, and so I can't distinguish what it comes from anymore.
Yes, right,
know,
which
basically.
is a thrill. I mean, you are that interdisciplinary. You are the.
I mean, sometimes I can be like, I remember this seed came from this place.
Right.
Part of it, but I think about the words intersectionality and interdisciplinary. They're easy words, just like Judeo-Christian or something, right? Easy words to use. I mean, critical is a word newer to me and to use to describe subverting something in a way, but then I think someone's even copyrighted it as used in some context. But anyways, yeah.
Talk about property.
I mean, these things are interesting, but like intersectionality came from a Black woman philosopher, and I forget her name right now.
I'm forgetting her name too.
But I've seen some people in the left say that people who aren't Black shouldn't use that word to talk about their oppression or their or leverage that word. But I think sometimes when we plant these things in the world that represent something in a moment, and it's like you can't control how people are gonna take it, you know, and in some ways.
Private property. I don't see that as appropriation.
Yeah.
Because if we look at the trickster, for example, the trickster is, I mean, that is a cross-cultural being. My lineage of Sephardic, Arab Jewish background, the Joha the trickster, Goha the trickster in Arabic. That figure of the crossroads, I mean, that's, to me, that's, again, going back to your initial question about what is my work, that's being alive, being continually witnessing these crossroads and reveling in the spaces between the crossroads, and what does it mean to, for example, with women, Sephardic women who would have a rusty nail in their hair to protect themselves. Am I not supposed to use a certain language because that kind of relationship to amulets and talismans are relegated to this indigenous group in this culture. And so somehow there's property now delineation around that acceptability. Yeah, I to me, that's just taking on the language of the oppressor and having ourselves just seep that kind of ethnocentrism and power structure that does not acknowledge, for example, those women in my history with the rusty iron nail in their hair to protect their children, as an evil eye, for example. Just because it's not known, in U.S. culture, people don't even know, even U.S. Jews, very few people even know that what a Sephardic Jew is, or that Arab Jews even exist.
Identity, that the homogenizing force against the diversity of what actually is our world. And then, of course, what diversity means as a word and how we leverage that. All these words have become symbols of things, and then what it actually means to live it and be it and embody it is not that easy to symbolize in a word and leverage, And so then in the realm of, as we've kind of touched into the realm of cultural appropriation, which is a whole other huge piece.
Land acknowledgements.
Because there is some element of this resistance to the homogenization by saying, well, we have to keep something that feels like ours, but then holding on to staticness isn't like that. Attachment to something nothing is static, right? Everything is always in movement and flux, including what we call culture, as well as how words are constantly transforming what they mean. And that's sometimes they get used as a continuation of what's still harmful, even though people are saying it's not, and then other times the words are avenues weaponized towards openings.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I named my son Zazu because of that kind of impermanence. Because it's some variation of Zazu in Hebrew means movement, and to represent that flux and the dynamism of what it means to be in relationship and always always moving beyond what we think we know.
The web,
the constellation. Yeah.
Gosh, how sensitive are you to talking about identity in the current conflict that's happening right now?
In Gaza, Israel. Yeah. Oh, I'm happy to.
Okay, because I'm so I am obviously not an expert about, and this is not something I had planned, but something you just said, and I've been thinking about a lot, and of course, I've been trying to research the whole thing from a religious perspective, or me as just trying to understand what came to be to where this is now, and how there's so many contradictions of people's generalized ideas, on the left and the right of the, people who, whatever side of the situation they're on, there's well, these people are like this and these people are like that, but there's so many things that mix up people's idea of what other is within this conflict, because obviously Jewish people have been othered for so long.
Well, and there is no Jewish people.
Yeah, people even just the in the diaspora of...
There's, right.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Right.
And then, and there's so much diversity within what that supposedly means.
Right. That's what I mean, there is no one singular...
And then even Arabic is a word, historically, right, that was created to try to put a whole group of people in a homogenizing identity. Right. So how does this, and then you see in the conflict, there's and it's funny to call it a conflict. I don't know what else to call it. A war, a genocide, a devastation, a really horrible coming together of things that all these other outside influences are pulling in. And, of course, trauma is a word mixed in. And I guess, there's so many assumptions people have about, these people are like this, and these people are like this. And so, Arabic Jew...
Right.
Are not words people think of together often.
No. I mean, I've been in Jewish spaces where people have said Arab Jews don't exist, and I'm looking at them and I'm saying, well, this is my flesh and blood, and I'm here, and I can hear my voice, and I can feel my stomach, and I exist, and that's my history, and those are my histories, and even when people say this is a brown-skinned oppression people issue, and I'm thinking,
that's not
you have
simple.
no fucking idea. Yeah, you put a Palestinian and a Sephardic person, or a Palestinian and a Mizrahi, and you can't tell the difference between people, especially in the left. This is another great example. Assuming Zionism and Judaism, and what is Judaism and what is a Jew in the U.S. is so different from in a European context, in a Southern European and Northern European context, and for us to garner violent opinions and then act on them collectively is really right. I mean, we're just it's more divide and conquer.
Yeah, like I was reading some stuff about like the positionality of other for power. You know, not to generalize about all Jewish people, but like, you know, with the Holocaust, there was this putting all Jewish people in a category as other, as the reason for all these problems and all these things. Right. The easy way to scapegoat people when there's all these other things actually happening. Yeah. And now the people are, it's like almost flipped, like, this is something I was just reading about anyways, like this positioning Jewish people as the edge of modernity in the Western world, fighting against these people who were earthly, who were tribal, who were like, you know, this is like the way that it's being like, oh, those people are animals, so, and these people are civilized, which is so, how crazy how fast that like flipped from like, and it's obviously these bigger pieces of power and like leveraging people, a collective's trauma to gain power and all this stuff.
But it's also not hearing when Netanyahu refers to the Sephardic Jews as dust. I don't remember the exact.
Dust?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's I can ask my mom. But where are those histories? Where are those voices of not understanding the extraordinary bigotry within Jewish communities, or the extraordinary bigotry within Black communities, extraordinary bigotry within communities that have been historically marginalized within themselves because we're reproducing power structures that are being taken for granted as, and this goes back to property, you know, like as if it's a universal right to be able to turn on a faucet and have water, I'm not talking about clean water, but water come out of it. That is such a complicated ideology and idea, and it's just written off. That's a universal right. I remember when I was 18 having this argument with my dad, you know, about what are universal rights, and he was insisting, again, it's not about clean water and contaminated water, but the water faucet. Like, not have where people don't have to travel far on foot, or electricity. You know, when that is seen as liberation, that is seen as freedom. When communities
housing, but what is that?
Right. What kind of house? Right. When people are being poisoned because of the off-gassing in their housing. And our house, as a converted school bus, is seen as derelict. It's seen as junk. Even though every screw, we know, we have a relationship with every screw in that bus. We know where every element came from. We know, you know, we don't know the histories of the miners, obviously, of the people, in terms of the embodied energy of the steel from that screw, but nothing is taken for granted, and that home is seen as detracting from property value from our neighbors, for example. That's why we've had to move, you know, from Boulder County. We had to move. I mean, we feel on edge here, you know, and to me that's very much related into to what we're speaking about in terms of ethnicity and racial categories and power within those racial categories, and then making assumptions about this person, because of our intergenerational trauma, we're then reenacting.
Yes.
But
marginalizing the people who've been marginalizing, then now getting given power to marginalize someone else and reenacting some sort of pain, you know.
And but then even the idea of marginalization, that's still, when we're still using the framework of marginalization, just like we're using the framework of equality, that's still basing it on a white, heteronormative, Eurocentric, modernity, you know, advanced capitalism framework, that universal right. Like healthcare, as if access to a hospital is a universal right, when, wait a minute, what about seeing the history of hospitals, and that the history of hospitals, when I read about
forced sterilization, eugenics, so many things.
Iatrogenics, right? And physician-induced, hospital-induced diseases, the third leading cause of death in this country. And yet that is seen as a universal right. I mean, and I fought for universal health care, like in 1992. I mean, that's what one of my jobs was, canvassing for universal health care. And then Clinton was elected, and we thought, okay, well, maybe we'll have some help here. And of course, we didn't. But that, if there's a car accident, yes, everyone should be able to go to the hospital and have their limbs put back together on their bodies. But if that is seen as a priority above, right, healthcare, just like what you're doing with your herbs and how we eat, and that from the free store, from the shared opportunity, use local soul space, that towel that you're getting from there, that's disgusting. No, actually, that is so much healthier, quote unquote. It's so much more enlivening for our well-being than going to a store and getting a new towel that is coated in triclosan, an antibacterial that we know is carcinogenic. And
yet it's somehow legal.
And that's
when it's illegal
officially
to live off grid and poop in a bucket.
Right.
A lot of the time.
Right. It's because of sewage politics, and again, infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right. How do we create infrastructures
fear
that
the
are
body? Yeah, a lot. You know, in this podcast over the years, like, there's been so many eras, and in the beginning of it, I was a lot more nervous about saying the wrong thing on the podcast, especially since I find myself in a lot of worlds. Like, I grew up in conservative Southern Virginia, like tobacco country, Southern Baptist, and having to fear what to say in that place.
Yeah.
When fabulous. I, as a young person, I took like religious studies classes in high school at the community college with a retired University of Kentucky theology professor, because I was like, I want to get into why do people believe these things here so adamantly? I was already like asking those questions in a place that had that kind of most of the time, as a person socialized as a woman or as a white person, there's a certain position I had of privilege, and also intersectionally, right? We use that word, lack of privilege at the same time or something. And having any questions about the status quo was a huge, danger sometimes, or
major faux pas.
A big, sometimes literally dangerous.
Right.
Or whatever that means, violence, danger, but
physical.
And then finding myself in leftist anarchist communities on the West Coast, Portland and the Bay, and all, in these other realms, in the languaging and the world, what people's reactionary narratives were to supposedly maybe what I grew up, it's not that simple though, those worlds. Both of those worlds felt equally oppressive to me in some ways.
Yeah, totally.
And yet I found solace in aspects of each. I missed the simplicity of the place where I grew up. I missed, some of the kind of nostalgia of America and that place, aspects of it. There's so much of it that I did not miss too, but then there's aspects of that supposed other side that I found solace in, and also a lot of stress around. Right. And there's been an element of especially around different times where you feel as though if you have a platform in some way, you need to speak about it, and you have to speak about it in a particular way. But I've never really felt like that's how I want to respond. I'm not going to hang out on Instagram and recite, well, this is a universal right, healthcare, this is a universal thing, the faucet turning on, these things. And even with this war, I have had a hard time knowing the best way to respond, because there's a lot of social pressure, right, to to be an activist, I'm using all these quotations.
Yes.
in a particular way, and yet none of that's really done anything.
No.
And so there's this fear, of not using the right language, but a lot of these words are symbolic and not actually embodied or lived out. And my response is usually more taking time to digest and research and understand and empathize and see the ways that it isn't dual, and maybe I get in trouble with some people because they want to see it as completely black and white.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Or seeing the web of worlds that created something that feels tragic, I guess is a word we can use.
Yeah.
I had and sometimes fearing that I'm going to say the wrong thing, or that it's a subject I shouldn't talk about, or that's for someone else to get into or something, but I'm just
as if you don't have authority to enter into that territory, or it's too precarious.
Jewish or Arab or Palestinian or whatever all these categories are.
Right.
And even though I study religion, doesn't mean I'm
Yeah.
I'm not embodying the experience in the ways that other people are. Right.
Can be able to ask questions.
Yeah. So question asking is what I'm most interested in.
Yeah.
How can. Yeah, I had someone on last year, Jason Hone. We did a Ethnobotany of the Holy Lands episode, and he's actually Mormon.
Wow.
But he grew up in Israel, in that region. His father was a professor doing historical archaeology stuff, so he was teaching people how to make wine the old way, teaching people how to do grind flour and harvest it from the wild the old way, and that kind of was relevant to most everyone there, the history of people's relationship with land in that place.
Beautiful.
And I didn't think we would talk about the conflict, and then we did a bit, and it really was an interest, and he talked about the whole history of that region and the ecological history, and it was a really
fantastic.
I was like, I don't know how to respond right now, but I think this is just let's talk about the land as a character in this right now.
Yeah.
Because there is that. Anyways, that was one way I responded.
But
I don't know.
Yeah,
listen to it sometime if you have.
I would love to. Yeah, I mean that sounds exquisite. It sounds critical.
I mean, I got people criticizing that it wasn't radical enough.
Oh.
Either. It wasn't
Well, what is radical enough?
I know, but I'm I don't know. I'm just taking pieces.
Does it mean
doing something?
Does radical enough mean that there's actual transformation going on? I was at an event this weekend where there was a woman who was drawing, I felt, a binary between activism and farmers. And on the bumper sticker on the back of her van is, "Don't ask an activist, ask a farmer." And my feeling is I want to retch, and I feel like since I was a child, because of the way I grew up and because of my own ancestral history, celebrating the relationship between organizing and being active, meaning using your voice and asking questions and acting questions, and not accepting anything as taken for granted, is, again, going back to work. Is only the farmer working because they're planting? To me, that feels like a really privatized, it hits back. I felt like there was a lot of spiritual bypassing going on, where there's a sense of holier than thou in the incrimination of someone else as being holier than thou by saying that the activists are telling other people what to do.
Or, I mean, just for me, my immediate thought is what kind of farming are you talking about? And how is it that farmers aren't activists in certain ways?
Inherently.
And how would...
Just like being a mother, you're giving birth. There's an inherent... Of course, how we raise our children is critical to social justice and critical to ecological consciousness.
I mean, I have friends who are activists in cities and they're farmers, and that's part of their activism.
To be in an urban environment.
And doing that.
Right.
I think that bumper sticker in a way symbolizes this false dichotomy we have between city and country, and what we think about what those people do. and that an activist is someone disconnected from the reality of what it means to live a salt of the earth life. Right. Salt of the earth, of course, also has, Jason actually talked about that in the episode. Coming from salting the Holy Lands, the history of the Romans salting the Holy Lands, actually, but we use salt of the earth to talk about people who are dusty and have connection and are rough around the edges because of that, or also have this authenticity in ways.
Well, I just want to say I play a lot with salt as a character, like you said, land as a character in my cross-cultural climate justice book, in Zazu Dreams, Between the Scarab and the Dung Beetle, a cautionary fable for the Anthropocene era. Salt is one of those characters, and the multiple ways of interpreting salt and how it has been seen as, it's both as an evil eye and struggling against evil, and it's seen as something that is a form of contamination, but also a form of an architectural element, while also destroying agriculture. I mean, so there's so
food preservative, and it kills plants.
Yeah, but right, exactly, yeah. So these complexities, that's to me the joy of living. For me to wake up and feel like everything is solved. You know, I mean, people want solutions, which is also a complete illusion. What if those complexities fed us, and what if those contradictions fed us, and what if knowing that edge, that friction, actually was ignition? I mean, that is what flame is, right? I mean, it's from the friction. And we're always trying, especially in U.S. society, right, puritanical society, where just keep it down, temper it. You're being too much. You're too intense. You're asking too many questions. You're shaking too many trees. Nelson Mandela, what was his name? The troublemaker. I'm forgetting his family's the translation of troublemaker, but it's tree shaker, I think. Well, otherwise, what's the point? You know, for us to wake up and be automatons, and just to be in our little Edward Scissorhands Pleasantville, and why?
Like, why is that even what our goal is? For sure.
To find comfort. Like, what is comfort?
People actually happy in that? Yeah. Like,
that's to be without, you know, where everything is 70 degrees. There was a movie in the 1970s, Silent Running, I think it was, and it was a sci-fi with Peter Fonda, I think, where they create kind of like what's going on now, where we're looking towards Mars. Well, we're going to destroy Earth, so we're just going to reproduce our values on a different planet. And that's kind of what happens in this movie. But everything is neutral, you know, it's comfortable. And, you know, Googling, you can just find the answer immediately. Just Google it. And without the anguish of ecstasy and despair, you know, or the exquisiteness of ecstasy and despair. And could we have infrastructures that aren't just based on hiding where water and electricity and where everything is going? Yeah. And
hiding, and like hiding the reality of death from us too.
Yeah.
And
and birth.
Yeah, death and birth are hidden. You know, the like visceral pieces of that we, you know, consider edgy or like uncomfortable, right? Like that our bodies do these things, like die and birth, you know. And that's something you explore a bit in your work too. It's like the body, and like what are we doing with that, you know? Mm-hmm. I think, and then thinking about Trickster and all this too is like having both the beautiful and the horrid together
in dialogue
is part of the living in a more full way, I guess.
Yeah.
I often think in the world of philosophy, like, what are the goals of, like, I mean, for me, the way it's translated and getting really into botany and plants, and, like, of course, I'm questioning constantly science and botany and all these things. It's helpful.
As Tex
Or just
taxonomies.
Just all the problematic nature of research and
colonialism and
the biases and the ways things are categorized and everything. And it informs my work too, of like, this is one way of measuring and like looking at and learning and naming life. But it's not the only way. I always preface, you know.
Right.
I mean, there's some philosophers, I know we're like kind of, there's a philosopher, I guess it's Tyson Yakumpora, writes about like into Aboriginal and language in Australia, like Aboriginal Indigenous people who live in what's now Australia. Their language, like many Indigenous languages, don't have the object as a non-living being in the way it's being spoken about. Right. It's a living, slinkied out, like expanded. Right, slinky. Yes. I don't know the right word to use, but slinky is the word I think of. The slinky is literally like a word is not just this; it's the whole slinky. Yeah. And and thinking about.
But let me just say something about Tyson, because he and I were talking about the new edition of Zazu Dreams, which came out this year, where Vandana Shiva wrote the foreword, and he was giving me some responses because he was going to write a piece too for the new edition, and he spoke about my people, quote unquote, as the Jewish people. So even someone who is so profoundly breathing and publicly communicating about, let's say, this totally reductive, but cultural diversity, Aboriginal ethics.
He's still coming from a particular. He says "my woman" a lot too, which is interesting.
Right. Well, there's a whole sexism thing that I haven't necessarily witnessed, but I know a lot of people.
Or have heard that.
Right. It's a criticism. Yeah. And how do we and how do we see, for example, someone who is completely, so this not about Tyson at all, but I've been completely dumbfounded about people who are struggling against racist hegemony, for example, but don't see the relationship to homophobia, or don't see the relationship to class issues, or where race is seen as something separate from these other realms of other realms of extraordinary oppression, rather than the same infiltrating, strangulating tendrils are feeding all of these systems. And to me, that's emancipatory, to see that kind of relationality and to be able to act on it from that point. And so this goes back to your question about interdisciplinarity. Like that, when we can approach the simultaneity, the pluriverses, as not washing out and saying, this is equivalent, this hell is equivalent with that hell by any means, but I 100% feel in every cell that there's no way that we're going to begin to address climate, chaos, racism, any of the realms without dealing with their common roots. And how are we going to deal with that on a daily basis, from the moment we wake up, from the moment we're asleep?
I think looking at the roots, trying to figure out what some of the roots are, is important. Like, I had a person on last summer at this time, Calix Liddick, who is I would call her a philosopher, but she's a really smart researcher, and she has a herb school in Pennsylvania, but she teaches in cities a lot, in New York too, and places that we have weedy plants a lot. She really loves to get into the invasive plant conversation, which is a whole thing, these words and culture and things around how can we even call plants bad and things like that. But she connected and this is not like she came up with this, but she just brought forth, and it kind of really, I already kind of knew this, but it wasn't a main character in my mind, and now I can't separate it of how much eugenics is connected to the conservation world. And then that translating into our language about plants and ecology, but also how eugenics as a force.
Well, and the term ecology, it comes from a eugenic background, right?
Yeah. Like how eugenics and native biotica, a native plant, is, you know, the idea that we can draw lines about what it means to belong, or any, you know, these kinds of things. And that race as a construct of, like, we can decide a person is good or bad, or we can decide a plant is good or bad based on these very often blurred lines that we can decide to redraw at any moment based on who we want to give power to, or whatever. That she really illuminated that connection and went through a bunch of history that I didn't know about in the episode, and I think it was really just a piece I don't hear a lot of people talk about. And they just spout out, like, well, this plant's bad, it's invading, it's disgusting, it's all these
ecology
things.
It's somehow there's a purity when it was part of Nazi ideology, and I mean, there's so much that we, again, taking for granted.
And native biotica originating in British common law, in like this idea, and in the relationship between the country people and the civilized people in the city, and like what plants are in relationship to what people and how they live, and that all these things end up moving into the world, and like so
as norm.
It's
norms that we take for granted.
And even in trying to react to what feels oppressive about some of that, we still reinforce it. Like, well, if you don't appear this particular way, then you don't belong in the space. And I don't know how to, this is all very uncomfortable and messy, and I don't know the right way to talk about any of it, but it's like, how are we making things worse sometimes? And yet, too, people could decide how they want to make spaces for themselves whenever they want, like, and if they want to take the like things that have been pushed onto them and then create spaces around that, then they can do that, Well, and it's like we can always be playing with what that means to be in the identity that's both ours for us to figure out and then influence from the outside, and sometimes these violent histories, I guess. And so I guess I'm thinking about like with plants, it's so the Siberian elm that's all in the around here, like is considered an invasive plant that doesn't belong here. But it's certainly providing a lot of shade. And maybe some of them get cut down and some stay, And it's like, are we going to decide they don't? I mean, at one point, are we going to just accept that they are here? And how do we...
This is right. We're folding in.
Anyways, these are all a bunch of thoughts all together about all this, and it's just the root of eugenics in all of this.
Yeah. I mean, as someone coming from a very clear diaspora people who have... And my people have been seen as parasites, for centuries and centuries, and... definitely an invasive species, and then have been used, like the Sultan, the Ottoman Empire, wanted the Jews to come there for what they thought would be economically beneficial, so that it was like maybe using kudzu for medicinal properties in North Carolina, And is that coexistence? Is that manipulation? Is that... when the Sultan was done with the Jews, they were exterminated. I mean,
wow.
Where are the lines of use? And I mean, I'm even thinking of Bill Withers' song. He doesn't mind getting used because he's using his lover. Who's using him, so it's okay that you're using me because I'm using you too. And is that the ecozoic, with Thomas Berry's ecozoic, with mutually beneficial? What is transactional? What is intimacy? When we're building economies or alternative economies like Soul Space, what are we reproducing in terms of materialism or acquisition, or are we doing something radical? you know, or are we just
convincing ourselves that we are?
Yeah, and at the bottom of the totem pole of capitalism, and the vultures groveling for used materials. I obviously don't believe that at all. But as someone who's never owned a car, for example, or a smartphone, and I get rides, I've known plenty of people who refuse to even get into cars, but I definitely get, as a mother also, and for me that kind of relationship isn't just a relationship of me being a vulture on the norm by getting a ride from someone, but co-creating unexpected relationships, unpredictable affinities, you know, where there's another kind of humanity that's in exchange. People who I would never have had a relationship with, I can end up building many-year friendships because I got a ride with them, that kind of thing. And other people think that I'm absolutely full of bullshit because I justify getting a ride, but then, you know, pontificate about car culture. And I want to know about the space between, about those cracks, and let those cracks foment.
I think Bayo Akomafe's cracks. He speaks about
Akomalafe. Yeah, I mean, right. And
cracks in between. Yeah, I mean, it makes me think, because I was obviously researching, like, how do we get to where we are? Not everyone can really do that, or, like, has the space to do that in the world we live in. So sometimes it's like, what feels like a proper way to react from this place, even if we don't know why we're here, and we don't know what's blurring us from seeing what's so-called real, what can we do from this place moving forward? That, I guess another question I had was, what is the artist-philosopher? How is that an important role in this, whatever we want to define artist or philosopher as, because some people don't even like that term, even though I would consider them artists. And part of that might be doing things that move outside of, even if we don't know why we got to where we are, like, what do we do to react to what feels more oppressive, connecting, or what feels oppressive? Like, So
something you said reminded me of something that I've gotten, I guess, backlash for, criticism for many, many years, which is I have the quote-unquote privilege to be having this conversation, or I have the privilege to be living in a bus, or I have the privilege to have never made more than $8,000 in a year, and generally I make no more than $2,000 in a year, and so that's a privilege, I'm told. And again, that goes into these illusions of what equality is and standard of living. And it's so, that criticism is so embedded in the very thing that those people, quote unquote, feel like they're fighting against in terms of equality, in terms of privilege, entitlement. Like when you were talking just now, I thought of the mothers of the disappeared in Latin America, in South America, in Chile, again, for example. They call themselves, they reappropriated the name Las Locas, the crazy women. And it's not that they had the privilege to be quote-unquote activists. They had to put their bodies on the line because their sons, brothers, husbands, fathers were being disappeared by the dictatorship. So the whole idea of some people can and can't take risks for political, or maybe people don't think I'm taking a risk. Maybe people think, I mean, I've gotten lots of criticism about being self-righteous and arrogant. And I really question, where is that projection coming from?
Right.
Because for me, that's not coming from a place of knowing who I am, either as an individual or my family lineage. And
or people speaking about women who don't act like, or people socialized as women. Of course, these words about how we talk about gender. I don't know the appropriate.
Yes.
Socialized as women, female-bodied, or whatever. But being too much if you're outspoken, that's an interesting thing.
Right, the too much of right.
And then you know, you have a PhD, right? Or something, you know, you could have a fancy job at a university and probably be making a lot more money than you do now. So, but you're choosing not to do that, at least for now.
Well, also because my work is, I'd say, too interdisciplinary.
It's too interdisciplinary. That's why I haven't been able to get grants for this podcast. But it doesn't fit in a category easily that it's digestible to someone who has found money in a foundation.
Yes.
Where rich people are giving, you know, rich people who may be well-meaning and awesome or whatever, or not, giving money to a foundation to then disperse it. It has to be clear-cut, easy to understand, divided into categories.
Digestible.
So how do you...
Again, the tyranny of clarity.
So, like, in academia, there's often this, just like, oh, the activist and the farmer are supposedly divided, and they're separate, even though it's like in academia... It's sometimes the institution of academia does create that hierarchy of better than.
Oh, of course.
And people who don't have access to academia or think they don't have access to that world.
Right.
And then in philosophy in particular, it's often like, what are you talking about? Like, I try to go home to my little town and try to talk to my family about what I was reading and learning. They're like, we don't care. We don't understand what you're talking about. And, can we just...
And you're, quote-unquote, making me feel stupid.
Yeah.
I mean...
Yeah, of course, me as someone, I don't really have as strong of an accent now, but coming from where I grew up, a lot of people didn't understand what I was saying when I was in college at first, because I had a really strong accent. Southern. And so I was almost seen in a different way, too, coming from a rural area where, like, a lot of people don't go to college, into a space where a lot of other people there had really fancy schooling in high school, and I was in one of the poorest counties of Virginia, and then coming in, it was like an interesting intersection of, well, you have the privilege to go to college, but then there I often felt kind of like shy about how to even talk to people.
Yeah.
And then in the world of philosophy, then coming back into the space of where I grew up, like, and not being able to understand how to connect with people around some of this, because it's all the words. It's like, how do you make it relatable?
Yeah.
How do you not... In the abstraction, in some of these words, and how maybe they don't make sense to some people, you know, like hegemony, like, what does that mean?
Well, even,
you know, like, people think, well, then you think you're better than us, or whatever. And I got that too.
Yeah.
Oh, you think you're better. Sometimes people where I grow up think that I hate or dislike the people where I grew up because I have questions
differently and
I have written publicly sometimes controversial writing that both questions
you question yourself
as
much as
thought that
else.
I'm somehow better coming in here
in
subtle ways, and also the contradiction in what I see in that place at the same time, but people can decide to read what they want out of it,
and that's the thing. There's so even at UC Santa Cruz, which is, you know, an Ivy League upper class essentially university, even there, the word hegemony, like, I had students who called it the H word, and they would just they were really insulting to me that I used the H word, for example, and that was in a university context. So even, you know, there's so much anti-intellectualism even in academia, you know, and so there's no clean spaces. There's no
academia is sometimes I want to go back to school so I can have some mentorship and, like, work on certain projects that maybe I could get funded, or, like, have some new perspectives. But then I was just at Elsewhere for a month with some MFA art students, and then their mentor Carol came for the last week, who's awesome. But all of them both loved aspects of what they were doing and also felt very critical of how academia actually restricted their creativity or their philosophical process in a lot of ways of what they were expected to create and present for the gallery, which is a very bourgeoisie, like, constructed space to put your thing into.
And be accepted, commodified and be accepted. Well, I think, again, this goes back to, the interdisciplinarity and what is an activist, what is an organizer, what is art. I just saw, again, Norma Rae. Have you seen Norma Rae? You've got to see it. 1978. She's it's based on the true story of Crystal what's her name? Her first name is Crystal. Textile in Virginia. I'm pretty sure in Virginia. A textile factory worker, and it's all about the unionization of the textile factories, and the person who came, New York Ashkenazic Jew, light-skinned Jew, who was the bridge. This character, along with Sally Field's character, both real people, and of course there were language differences, there were cultural differences. I grew up partially in Dripping Springs, Texas, and my mom was seen as the New York Jew, and it's so many layers of hatred and misinformation and an inability to live, because of judgment.
Yeah.
And if we look at someone like Norma Ray, she is straddling, just like you were saying in your when you would go back and forth with your own language and your accent and your family alienating you and the students alienating you and you not knowing where you're standing. She was doing that too. She was the in-between, this light-skinned Jewish Ashkenazic union worker who was coming in to say, you don't have to live in such horrendously violating conditions, physically and psychologically. And it's a famous scene. She's standing up there with the word union. You've got to see it.
Okay.
And then
I'll have to be taking notes
and
after
let me
this
know.
and
link
it to something in the show notes for myself and for other people too. But
because that's the work. She was an enslaved worker, basically as a textile worker in the 70s in the rural South U.S., and a mother, and someone who's trying to live with some level of self-respect.
Yeah.
To me, that's living. She was enslaved by the textile corporations, and her refusal was an act of being alive. It wasn't just resistance. It was like, I am now alive. I am all of these things combined. And I am working with this person, this Jewish light-skinned person, or just, in their mind, just Jew from New York. And he's not telling us what to do, how to live, how to speak. And he's showing us that we don't have to live under such horrendous conditions. Because his family, from another culture, had suffered.
Right.
I mean, and it's these, when we talk about privilege, and we talk about, well, we're not supposed to use the word intersectionalism, that is just history erasure. And it doesn't mean we're all the same, obviously, by any means.
You don't even know, sometimes you don't know what people's history is.
No, by any means. I say I'm Jewish, people think, oh, Jew from New York, white Jew from New York. A lot of people think that. A lot of Jews think that. And that's not my history.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, these unpredictable affinities, who we thought, you and I may have more in common historically than, an Ashkenazic cis woman from, who I met in school in New York.
Mm-hmm.
As an undergrad, as an example.
It's
or not.
Right, I know, we don't know. And sometimes they find connection in the most just. It's really crazy sometimes, how all that happens in life. How we find weavings for moments, But the whole question about living simply or close to the land or with less as being a privilege.
Mm-hmm.
It's just such a. I'm so what do you want someone to do? Live in a. I don't know. Even in this town, if you had the money to buy a house, most middle class people still can't even afford a house, even in this tiny town where we are right now. So it's striving for that and not having to struggle to hustle to try to strive for something that it might not even be possible anyways is somehow a privilege. But it's like, and certainly, yeah, maybe like the choice to not want for the accumulation of capitalist material things, you know, when there are people in other worlds that just want to get out of their what they think is poverty.
Right, exactly what they think is poverty.
And become more modern.
Or what the U.S. has told them is poverty.
That us seeking this, what we think is better for the land, and then when there's people in other places seeking to gain what we are giving up.
Right.
That's where it gets really interesting. Yeah. But, you know, even like, it's not always that simple though. Like my friend Samuel, he's been on the podcast twice. He's from Oaxaca, Mexico, and he's like Zapotec. He went to school, Berkeley, and then in England, and got a PhD in sustainable manufacturing. And then he was like, this doesn't... And people who've listened to the podcast are a lot of fans of Samuel. You know, he's very interesting. And he's like realized, you know what, after all that, I just want to go back home, and like what my people have been doing, my people have been doing this whole time is actually the solution.
Right. Not
is this land-based living
in this
sustainable large-scale industrial manufacturing is not actually possible really for like a solution for living with the earth. Like, how do you make things in industrial scale in a sustainable way? He's like that. After studying that and doing a whole, you know, he sent me a copy of this paper which I looked through, but it was like, you know, it's a whole thing. Like, he's like, the solution was just to go back. And there's just, everyone's in a different place with that, and how our world is changing and globalizing and all of it so fast. It's like, how do we
so those bridges then, for example, when I was teaching for Bayo Komalafe's We Will Dance with Mountains, I was one of his guests for 3 different sessions, and one of the comments that someone made was Thoreau had, I forgot what they said, like a billionaire, not a founder, a philanthropist who was funding him. What is that?
Sponsor.
A sponsor, yeah, but I'm forgetting the term. But in other words, he was able to live freely, or he was able to live simply because he was being funded by a white person with a huge amount of power and money. I mean, that kind of reduction, I think, goes hand in hand with both the criticism, well, we can't go back, you know, return to the land. And there's so many embedded norms. I mean, this goes back to the very beginning of what we're in, we don't even see. Like the Ladino, my family's language is Ladino, the Ladino proverb, the camel does not see his own hump. When people, even in Bayo Komalafe's world,
so somewhere in between all the things, right? Yeah.
It's, I mean, that's where I begin to feel despair.
Yeah.
Because if the lack of willingness is so huge, and then with Samuel, his realization that his family had those answers to begin with, what about the bridge? What about the bridge between Thoreau and what Thoreau was refusing? Or the bridge between Samuel's family practices, lineage from maybe thousands of years, and industrial society? How do we, and that's what Zazu Dreams so much is about, how do we use ancestral technologies, ancient wisdoms, in the context of our devastating converging crises, rather than saying, oh, well, you're university educated and light-skinned in this context, and you have the ability to jump into someone's car, supposedly, to catch a ride, as if those are all incompatible. You know, rather than, again, where is the willingness to see seeds? Yeah. And instead of imposing solutions and judgment, instead
so much judgment.
looking for seeds. How can we plant this in a more generous way? People are really not wanting to be generous in how
sometimes you find them. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is something I come up against a lot and haven't known how to speak about. Like, the privileged should be able to roam around alone in public lands in the West. Of course, I am often, as a seeming cisgendered or queer, woman alone, so a person socialized as a woman alone, there is danger to that, I guess, right? But, like, then dwelling in the, like, well, that's a privilege for you to be able to do, this other person couldn't do that in the same way safely.
Right.
Does that then discredit the work that comes from that?
Yeah.
Or do we actually need to take that and say, well, what can we do to shift that?
Yeah, exactly.
So that anyone...
There's a lot of discrediting.
Like, how do you not Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, like... And I don't know the answer fully. Is there even... Or is that what we're even looking for? But it's like... There was one woman that used to teach about, like, white fragility. What was that lady's name? She was a white woman teaching about white fragility, and then at some point...
Who wrote the book?
Yeah.
I'm not remembering. Yeah, the
author, forget her name, but then she went and got under a lot of fire later because she made a lot of money off of her lectures and charged a lot of money, and her book made a lot of money, and then at some point people are like, you know what, actually, some people still really like the work, but, like, other people were really like, I don't know, that was good or not, and I don't know what to say about it. I'm just like observing.
I don't know either. Yeah, I think. Again, just like with musicians.
Yeah.
With rap. Yeah. Stars, hip hop stars. It's just with artists. Yeah. Who, I mean, so much of the argument is they got their money from Marlboro, and they're critiquing the tobacco industry. It just is, or their work is all about bodily consciousness.
But there's something, like, one of my teachers, Phoenicia Madrano, who is passed away now, she was this trans woman that lived on horseback in Nevada for 30-something years. She was also very coyote, trickster, very problematic in a lot of ways. She did hard drugs. She never said... She was very not politically correct. She said lots of offensive things. She also knew a lot about plants. Some of what she taught was just, like, the most amazing stuff ever, and one of the things she would... and some of it was... not good, but one of the things that and that was just the beauty of what she was, she would say, like, you use Babylon to subvert it, like, so she didn't live with very much money, like, she didn't participate in capitalism as, like, I have a job, and, but she did convince people to give her money to support her planting seeds, and she would do things to guilt you into giving her money so she could keep planting seeds of, like, camas and all these plants. No,
it's.
But, like, what is the artist getting funded by a cigarette company making art that's about criticizing the very thing that's funded them? Is that actually the same kind of thing? Yeah. Can we actually get away from that?
Or Michael Moore living in a $5 million house, when his whole thing is about critiquing corporate culture.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think it's laughable, and let's put it on the table and talk about it, rather than just condemning and silencing. I think one of the biggest problems is censorship. Yeah. When people just write people off, and then they don't have the opportunity, or we don't have the opportunity to discuss the complexities.
I was reading one of your pieces earlier. I mean, of course, I'd like to I wish I could have had time to read way more, but you had some show, and at the last minute, somebody was scared of your photos or something and decided that they didn't want to be a part of showing your photography publicly or something. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. Like, what is so scary about it? Like, I guess speaking to what you're just saying is, like,
with the censorship and the silencing. Yeah, well, I mean, that, I think the story that you're talking about is an incident that happened in 2009, but a piece that I just wrote for a new anthology on Irigere, on Luce Irigere, on the feminist philosopher, whose work is all about patriarchy as a given that we're just feeding into, even in our feminisms.
Yeah.
And that
totally.
When we're looking at female equality, we're basically women just trying to become men, like Thelma and Louise.
Yeah.
Empowerment through the very mechanisms of violence and destruction that supposedly we're critiquing. And in that incident, it was a conference about her, and my work was being projected behind Elizabeth Gross, who I was just corresponding with, who's in Australia now, who was speaking about Darwin, and the imagery that the tech thought that the work was too provocative, pornographic. He found it offensive, and what was ridiculous was that this was in the context of an Irigerean circle, this circle of specifically focusing on this philosopher whose work is all about the woman's body, the maternal body, about seepage, about difference, about our not assimilating to a norm of acceptability.
Yeah.
And it was allowed to be because the university had the final say. So my work, again, as it has been so many times, was censored because it didn't.
But it's telling. It
was a story that was just
basically
reinforcing, the very
what you were actually trying to say.
With my images, with
by the fact that they wanted to censor it, and that was that.
Yeah.
It planted so much. The questions that arise from it were enough that that person didn't want it to be. Yeah.
And that's been a gift with the censorships, that it has helped me understand what it is that I was doing, that I didn't even know necessarily what I was doing behind the camera when I was taking the photographs. Because, and this goes back to what we were talking about before in terms of the unknown and, again, unpredictable affinities, even within ourselves, that I, and that what you were saying about how you've internalized these different philosophers' ideas, and they're now a part of you, and you don't know necessarily who said what, but also with the images, when if we could learn to trust ourselves and trust our intuition, and then do something with the trust, and I don't mean do as in just be productive, commodified, colonized beings, but co-create and take risks, and we don't have to know where we're going. When I open my camera, I don't know where I'm going. When I begin to write, I know that there is an imperative. I know that there's something that has to happen in order for me to breathe. And having people respond, including all the censors, they're critical. And the people who say, oh, this work is only about anger and rage and pain. And I think, God, not at all. It's so much about, again, the cracks, the in-between, the liminality of the fertility of beauty that exists in those liminal spaces. And that the liminal spaces aren't actually liminal spaces. Those are the spaces. Yeah. The liminality is like with Aboriginal dream world. This is dream at night. That's the quote unquote real world. Or with surrealism.
Yeah.
That is reality. And walking into Walmart, I've never walked into Walmart, but what I would imagine.
Ever been to a Walmart?
I've never been to a Walmart.
Don't.
No.
No,
God.
I mean, I grew up where that was the only place to hang out, so.
Oh, wow, right.
Well,
as teenagers.
Lot or in the
parking lot.
That was all
right.
there was for teenagers, was
and
to walk around in Walmart.
And that's seen as reality.
Yeah.
When that's like beyond.
Couldn't skateboard anywhere.
Surreal, right?
You had to hang out in the Walmart parking lot with
and talk
all the
about
lights and
funneling infrastructures and funneling consciousnses.
I'm like, wow.
So yeah,
no
just
wonder we're all depressed.
Oh, yeah.
And on drugs.
Exactly.
But,
Exactly.
Anyways.
Yeah.
But you were about to say if you could walk into Walmart, then
Well, just that I find that so offensive. Like, to me, that is white modernity, Walmart. And because I'm lighter skinned and people may not know my heritage, and they're associating me with that mentality and that construction of reality, and that construction of desire, that's heartbreaking because of that closed-mindedness, that inability to see beyond, again, what we think we know. And my photographs and all of the negativity, all of the censorship, that has led to a blossoming and has led to clarity and vision.
Yeah.
Because I didn't just let it, for what, if people want to call it privilege, let it be silent.
Yeah, or it says something if your work is challenging people in that way, or creating some controversy, or you're not sticking to what's comfortable and like formulaic, you know.
Right. Or even something like we were talking about before with my images being provocative around relationship. At one point there was a woman who was photographing menstrual pads, bloody menstrual pads, and they were just tacked up on the wall, all these menstrual pads. And I found that irritating because it was just like one-dimensional. Here are my different bloody pads. And so here I found myself going into judgment, which was really informative for me, but also it helped me understand that what I was doing, again, intuitively, that the stories I was telling when I would put my bloody menstrual pad next to a bat's head or next to a moldy gourd with a medical latex glove wrapped around it, or my grandmother's false teeth because she was hiding during the Holocaust and lost her teeth. You know, those relationships, I felt like, not that I'm a better artist by any means, but when we're looking for the seeds, again, not solutions. So we're looking for a seed to deal with misogyny. We're looking for a seed to address the complexities of sexism and body phobia and how women's menstrual cycles have been seen as all of the horrible things that they've been seen as in so many cultures over so much time. For me, that pathway is through relationship, not just through that what feels like a one-dimensional demonstration of what the object is. And this goes back to Tyson and what you were talking about before, Tyson Yunkaporta, and what you were saying before about the objects and the slinkiness. If we are actually looking at the slinkiness and the movement of objects as verbs and not as nouns, that verb is what is so exciting, and that we can maybe only access through our intuition. And I don't think this has to do with privilege necessarily, that just because I was going to say I'm not struggling to feed my kid, and in certain ways I am, you know, but there's a shutdown that happens when people say, again, you have the privilege to live simply, rather than, wait a minute, there's more to it. There's intuition involved. And it's not just I have access to my intuition because I'm not working night shift at Walmart or something like that.
It's interesting to be privileged to not be struggling, like, in those particular ways. You might be struggling in other ways, like how cold it could get in the winter and having to poop outside or something like that, but like what it means. Even though
people would say, well, that's my choice, so that's my privilege.
But then it's not a privilege, or it's like somehow, what's the word, noble to then work the night shift at Walmart, and that's good. Like,
right, there's a martyrdom.
The martyrdom.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking.
And I just want to say, too, and because interdisciplinarity and intersectionality essentially are completely demeaned and denied, like the fullness, the phenomenally radical potential of inhabiting those worlds is not accepted, even in spaces where it's supposedly lauded, then I don't have that option at all. like I said, I'm not only making this much money because I want to only be making this much money. I mean, there's the systems that supposedly celebrate these worlds of complexity really don't in our world, because capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, racism,
and people might want to consume aspects of it, but then it's not like you're being celebrated by financial compensation.
No.
I'm in the same position.
No,
like
right.
Everyone, lots of people love the podcast, but it's not like I make a dime off of it.
Right, exactly.
And I'm in debt. So, and I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills in the next couple months. But it's like, figure it out. You just figure it out. But it is like interesting. It's what's
the projections.
Before we wrap up, I guess there's one thought that I was connecting while you were talking about.
And we can do another one in the future, too.
Yeah, we totally can. I've done multiples with other people, for sure, like Samuel. That, you know, I was thinking about the feminine body and the cultural association we have with it being this gross thing, or like this fearful thing, or like this...
Or sexual thing.
This, as even having any sexuality at all as being this kind of bad thing, you know? And somehow the connection between that and like what's gross in general, in my work, I did the Elsewhere residency last month, and you came to the show, and a lot of my work is about processing materials from one form to the next, and being a part of object, I guess, as verb in a way. I think you asked a question about that maybe in the talk a little bit, and
the storytelling.
We had a cool little crew of artists for that, but a lot of what I am in that process, there's a moment where sometimes things are gross, like for paper making, for fiber processing, for hide tanning, gross from our culture perception of like you can see death in it, and it's viscerally intense. The smell, the flies, the color, something about it may be viscerally intense in certain moments, and then that is then transformed back into some material that we can relate with and recognize that is far from its death, like the deer being, you know, this was a dead animal, like I'm holding up. This was a goat that my friend killed for me to make leather with, and you know, it's like now it's digestible and and like safe, right?
The I guess story, it's a beautiful undulation between these different worlds.
I guess I'm in my brain somewhere I'm drawing a parallel between the cultural resistance to the spectrum of visceral experience and in materials as a verb in this way, and our reaction to primalness and like the spectrum of what it means to be in a body in this world too, and then in a so-called female body in this world especially, and as our bodies represent Earth in some ways and all these things. So I don't know what I'm trying to say about it other than there's a parallel there, and I'm just curious maybe as a final thing if you have any, because that seems to be a big theme in your work, is like
absolutely
these pieces.
Well, especially in my photographs around the abject, and what is seen as something that should be internalized, and how, whether it's literal in terms of blood or in terms of hysteria, excess, you know, like excess of any kind. I see that as a relationship. I see the relationship between that kind of excess and vulnerability, and that kind of excess and how my work in every way, and work meaning daily living, how I mother, how I breathe, how I poop, how I acquire my food, is about this relationship between private and the public. And that seepage and that uncontainability, and the private is supposed to be contained, and it's supposed to be flattened and quiet, and again socially appropriate. It's supposed to be clean and
not sensory in one particular way, like that.
It's not supposed to be provocative and make you ill. Even a few weeks ago, when I was one of the presenters at the Universal Healthcare Days, that focusing on pleasure, and I was sharing my work around being a sex activist and a sex worker, and I do sex trauma counseling, using photographs, using imagery and text and writing. And I've used my photographs in sex therapeutic work for years in many different contexts, and gender and body issues where women who were saturated in such self-hatred around their bodies, and as models in my photographs, as objects within my photographs, developed very different relationships with their own bodies. They're private within this public space. And in this pleasure gathering where I was a care provider, let me see, there's so many tendrils. Let me try and track.
Did you have resistance in some way?
Well, let's see. It was about vulnerability and
well, the female body is being this controversial space. You also did some stuff on female ejaculation.
Well, it's about female ejaculation, right? But right, the privatized yeah. Sorry,
you had somebody say something to you. You said you're about to say like
that's someone. Oh, I'm sorry, I completely just lost it with all the different bridges. They just.
Well, I was wondering how that went.
Complex.
But you said that you come to that work with a particular. I don't know. I guess I'm.
Oh, I remember what it was.
Okay.
It was about Right. It was about the disgust. What you were talking about, the disgust, because I was sharing that, and this reminds me of two other things that we were talking about before in terms of the different layers of coming to consciousness. Right. So I was suggesting during that pleasure gathering, pleasure isn't just about pretty, and it's not just about feeling good and contentment or ease or happiness or even euphoria, but it can also be about disgust, very much self-disgust, or disgust with your partner. I'm not talking about rape, but those layers, I think, are very much a part of pleasure and a profound sexuality that is an erotic politics, where there's it kind of goes back to that artist with all the bloody menstrual pads just laid out.
That's like a whole wormhole, because one of my postmodern type philosophy classes in college we focused a lot on Desade's work, and we somehow got stuck on it. Like, my teacher was awesome, sure. Professor Teschner, I don't know, George Teschner, he's awesome. We somehow got stuck on Desade, and I think most of the class was on that, which is kind of like about what is this relationship between like the divine and like death and like sexuality and what turns us on, and like how close it gets us to the feeling of like what it means to
our
be
mortality.
Interconnected and everything, right? And sometimes that looks really controversial. And again, this is not saying like advocating for something like rape, but just like how that looks.
Our sexuality is so much more complex than just let's try and feel good.
Yeah, it's so
or just beauty, as if beauty. I'm so fed up, and this goes back to the spiritual bypassing. Like in this mother's event that I was on this weekend, it was about giving back. Much of it was about giving beauty back to the earth. Yes, we need to give beauty back to the earth. Enough with violating the earth. And things are a lot more complicated than that.
It might mean peeing right there too.
Right. Well,
literally peeing sometimes is like, I remember working on a farm, running a farm, where we had to water our onions, and we all just peed in the same bucket. In the garden, whenever we had to pee, we all peed there, and then we watered the nasty smelling, urine mix, fermented for weeks at a time, on the onions, and that grew the best onions. It's like,
and they were glorious,
and that was beautiful and gross,
and
necessary, and that death and that nasty smell. We all we carry each other's smelly poop buckets and urine buckets, and it's just like, okay, this is what it means to be part of this sort of spectrum of being.
Of being alive.
But I have a hard time sometimes in those spaces. I mean, I will be in them because I used to not want to, but like, I will be in them because it's one realm of many, and I don't take it as the only place to be in. But like the kind of focusing on that in that way, like the goddess, and like everything is cushy and beautiful and soft, and like I just
so fed up.
and not to use the word dark in a way that's harmful, but like I'm often more interested in the dark goddess, the dark ecology, the
well, I kept talking about Kali, and it wasn't welcome.
People were like, really?
Yeah.
Like you felt resistance to that.
Just censorship.
Yeah.
Censorship. Because maybe they don't have a sense of Kali and the complexities of Kali, but but I was saying she is both and.
She's the wind that comes through from the Uncompahgre and blows everyone's greenhouses down, or she is the flood that comes and makes more morels come up after they flooded part of the town or whatever. Kali is like an interesting piece of the beauty and the connection.
Again, it's this. We can't just be, because a solution implies, I feel, in the end, a certain kind of one-dimensionality.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not a solution.
Yeah.
But if it's a seed, then it has its mycelial complexities and its contradictions, perhaps, with what happens coming out of the earth.
I've been thinking a lot lately about, we talk about toxic masculinity, and then we talk about like. Then the feminism that's in reaction to that is also got harm attached to it. Well, I'm often like, what does good masculinity look like? What is like beautiful? Because I've often had relationships with men in my life, or people socialized as men, that are embodying things I feel like are harmful and reflection of the bigger harm in our culture, and not entirely, but then they're like, but what does masculine look like? Because I don't know if this isn't if this violence isn't masculine, what does it look like to be masculine? And then at the same time, too, what does it look like to be in the feminine? And it doesn't matter whether you have a body with whatever genitalia, but it's more about these energies. Like, if they're being taught to us in a particular way right now. And I was reading Sophie Strand's book, The Flowering Wand, last year, which is kind of her like trying to retell stories about the masculine in a realm of like, this is what the potential of what masculine could look like in a different way than what we're being told now, using these old stories. I guess I'm still kind of like, well, what if we're talking about like the feminine, the female body, or like these ideas of like, what does it mean to not be oppressing this energy in the ways that people who say they are actually still doing it? What does it also mean to like celebrate masculinity, or like masculinity that isn't oppressed too? And I don't know how to answer that. Sometimes I'm like, what?
Our culture definitely doesn't have a graceful way of exploring masculinity, let alone
masculinity embracing vulnerability as a part of what it means to be masculine too.
I have an image that I took years ago of a friend of mine, queer, socially determined male, who's naked and his testicles are laying on his leg in an awkward way, and he's face down but sort of twisted in a the grasses are almost purple, and his skin is very white, and he has red hair, so it's this kind of extreme color and relationships. And his in one exhibition I had in Lyon in France, the person thought he was an older woman, and that had been a prolapsed uterus.
Whoa.
And so I've gotten a lot of that with gender extremes. A series of my photographs that were censored in a university library was a woman's hairy upper thighs that had a lot of hair on them, and with different objects in in her lap. Shrimp shells, duckbill, photography strips from when I was doing my analog. This is all analog work. And that work was censored. It was on the walls. It had been okayed, but then it was censored because the people working in the building found it offensive that I had pulled a man's penis, that I had emasculated a man by pulling his penis back between his legs, because they couldn't conceive of a woman having that much hair on her upper thighs.
Oh, Jesus.
So it was just, you have to take this down because it's disgusting to me. And it's funny, even...
Or because it challenged...
their idea of masculinity. And primarily femininity, because those were women. And then, with the free store, the notice that we got for the violation with the free store, the language that they were using about what is seen as junk and what is offensive to passerbyers is no different than when I was doing naked yoga when I was pregnant on the roof in my apartment in Oakland, and the office skyscraper next door called the police on me because they found it offensive because I was naked. Or when my 1-year-old was naked in a park in California, and I was cited.
In California?
And I was cited for indecency. My 1-year-old. So all of that goes back to me, what you're talking about with masculinity. There is no way, if we lived in an environment where masculinity was seen in its complexities, that a 1-year-old child would be officially framed within the realm of indecency.
Yeah.
We don't. Right. We live in where we live, which is so horrifically talk about body dysphoria.
But then you've got the man at the river walking around naked and literally trying to show his private parts to people kind of on purpose, and then you're like, well,
right.
And there's some element of it, like, it's fine, and there's also power there, and there's also some element of, like, when you live in a culture where, like, you have to fear that, so there's, like, an element of, like, how is that such a fine line?
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, we're treading on these fine lines constantly, and I think that's part of the joy of it, and that kind of that reminds me of Bio's work.
Yeah.
And so many people's work around decolonizing our consciousnesses and our bodies, because we are on these fine lines.
Yeah.
And I did a series of dance pieces where I'm dancing on a balance beam, for example, in front of James Baldwin's prose of I Am Not Your Negro. Mm-hmm. And I'm dancing wrapped in plastic wrap used for, disposable plastic wrap used for packaging, Amazon bullshit, things that, like, I've never bought anything on Amazon, so I'm saying Amazon bullshit, and so that's judgmental of me. I got that, and I'm being absolutist, and the packaging is disgusting. I find that plastic packaging, and this goes back to what you're talking about with the disgust,
right,
and the gross. But so I'm wrapped in that in front of these images around Black identity politics and James Baldwin's prose, dancing on a balance beam.
Yeah.
And for me, as a person who I don't identify as white, and so conscious of these politics of language and politically correct, and that's a fine line. Totally a fine line.
Yeah.
And I've been criticized for it and celebrated for it.
Thanks for listening to the Ground Shots podcast. The music for this episode was by the band Top Down. They reached out to me via email when I did a shout out recently about including music, and offered some of their music to share. So I hope you enjoyed their music. You can find a link to their Bandcamp in the show notes of this episode. If you have music to offer and want to see if it can be possible to put on the podcast, please email me, kelly@ofsedgeandsalt.com, and I will consider your music for a future episode. I'm pretty open to any genre, so send it my way, even if you're not sure. And I'm also okay with different recording qualities, because I love the mix of lo-fi, low-key, and also high-res potential. So even if you record it with your phone, just send it to me and maybe it'll work. Hope you enjoyed this conversation with Cara, and you can find her Substack and other resources to her work in the show notes, as well as ways to support the podcast and links to my work, always in the show notes. And they are found incomplete on the Substack and on my website of sedgeandsalt.com. All right, y'all. Take care.
Back when things